Welcome to From the Classroom. I'm Nate Quinnell, Superintendent of Schools, and it's great to have you tune in. Thanks for taking the time. From the Classroom is a show that we shoot from East Hartford Public Schools where we try to tell a little bit about the story of our school system. We try to introduce our kids, our teachers, our administrators. And every year, we also want to take time to talk about some really important things going on. And that's what our session this month will focus on, and that's our school budget. And I'm really excited and pleased. Our repeat guest, Mr. Paul Mainuli, who is our Director of Business Service, joins us on the show. Paul, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be here, Nate.
Paul, we always work hard to find new guests and new opportunities. Paul is our most frequent guest, and I'm excited to hear from Paul today about some of our budget things.
It's good to be back again.
So, the East Hartford Public School budget, we're here to talk about this month and try to break down what is a really complex process that involves so many people, involves so many things, and has such important results because it talks about funding our school system, it talks about funding our kids. And for our viewers at home, certainly you probably hear about this from watching board meetings, you hear about this from maybe reading articles in the Gazette or the Hartford Current that have covered this. But we want to kind of expose a process that really for us starts all the way back in October, where we start with our school budget process, where we look at our schools and we put out a process to principals asking what's needed in schools. We are very careful in this process. This is not meant to be a wish list. This is meant to be a reality as to what are our needs. In turn, that budget comes to the Board of Education. Paul and myself, we work through those requests, those ideas carefully. We are trying to align our school budgets and our district budgets to our strategic plan, which lays out over 5 years. And we build what we call a superintendent's budget proposal, which ultimately is due to the Board of Education just before Thanksgiving. So our board spends a week or so reviewing that. We meet in a joint session with our council and with our mayor and our Board of Education together, where we kind of outlay the parameters of our budget. The board goes through a series of very detailed workshops where they break the budget apart. They go line by line, understanding what that proposal means and how those numbers impact us on an overall picture. And then the board ultimately, before Christmas, approves a budget and works to approve a budget, which in turn is sent to the mayor and to the council for review. So we are in that process right now. Our budget is in the hands of the mayor, who is working on putting together an overall budget for the entire town. We will present our budget on February 27th to the town council in the chambers. We're looking forward to that opportunity. But this is a really lengthy process that's influenced by so many pieces of needs, of action plans in place, and of course, state funding. And Paul does an incredible job kind of quarterbacking that and leading that process. And we hope that becomes clear for our viewers. So kind of diving in here, Paul and I have been together for a long time working this process. When we think about our district profile, why are we doing this? We think about our kids. In East Hartford, around 5% of our students, we're incredibly diverse. 5% of our students are Asian, about 34% Black, around 6% Hispanic, around 15% white. Our schools are 100% free and reduced lunch, or what we call community eligibility provision, meaning our students, 100% of our students eat free and reduced lunch. And what's really exciting about our schools is that out of almost 7,000 students in our school, we have over 50 different languages being spoken and over 62 different countries served. It's a really neat conglomerate of really passionate and powerful kids who are the future of East Hartford. Kind of looking at the history of enrollment over time in East Hartford, we see very, very stable enrollment overall. Currently this year, we're just under 7,000 students, around 6,866 students. But we see some very significant trends growing of students with special needs, as well as students with what we call who are English language learners. And we welcome those students to our district. We're thrilled to serve them. But as we talk about a financial picture and supporting their needs, these require additional services. And that's something that shows up in our budget process every year. Overall, so we're investing in kids, we're investing in results. What are the results? And, in East Hartford, for me, and for all of us who work there and who serve there, and you at home whose children go to school there, we certainly are seeing results that talk about a district on the move. And we're proud of these results. Our graduation rate is around 89%, which is outpacing the state averages. We have seen incredible gains in our SAT student performance. 45% of our students meet the benchmark on the SAT writing and reading component. And one thing we're really proud of is our AP classes at our high school. We've worked hard to make our high school have a rigorous and challenging program recognized by universities around the country. Over 55% of our students in AP classes are passing that AP test, which is receiving a 3 or better, which compares very competitively on a global level around 60%. Our state achievement results, we continue to see growth, but there's significant need. 35% of our students are achieving at proficiency on maths, on Smarter Balanced Reading, and around 23% on the math part. So we have a lot of work to do, but a story of growth and a story of a district headed in the right direction. So with that all being said, let's dive into the budget. So, when we look around our state, one of the important things we talk about is per pupil expenditures. So, Paul, can you tell our viewers what per pupil expenditure is and kind of where this shakes out?
Yes, basically what it is all of the resources, all of the financial resources in a school district are applied to the total overall student population in the district. It determines how much each county or each town is spending on a per pupil basis for the students in their district. If you look at the map that we show here of the state, you can see that we're lagging behind most of the communities around our area. We're just a little over $14,000 per pupil. And when you look at the state average of being over $16,000 per pupil, you can see that we are indeed we are behind significantly, and then that's where we need to catch up.
Why is that so significant? You look at that and you say, $14,000 versus the state average around 16.
When you look at that, if you did the math, if you took our just under 7,000 students and multiply that by the gap between the 16.5 and our 14.7, our 14.3, you can see that additional money, that $1,700 or $1,800 times 7,000 students, is significant. And that's how much more money will need to be brought into our district in order to make us comparable with the state average on a per pupil basis. And that's really important to understand, is that, we're working with a proposed budget of next year of a little over $94 million. In addition to that, we're bringing upwards to $27 million more in state and federal grants and foundation funding. But again, it's keeping our services and all of our programs in place for the students in East Hartford. But again, it is a real balancing act every year when we prepare our budget and utilizing state and federal resources, what the town appropriations are for us, as well as the other monies we bring in through some of the revenue sources we have in the school district. So there's a lot going on to make a budget every year. There's a lot of details. But I think what's important in the way we've actually display our budget and what we've done over the past few years, there are lots of details. It's prudent, it's conservative, our estimates are always such, but more importantly, it's transparent.
Yeah.
One of the things that we really have, I think we've done a really good job with over the past few years is basically laying out just what our budget consists of, what the budget drivers are, how they're impacting us, how state or federal decisions may be impacting us, what the reality is going forward if certain things were to happen with respect to funding. So I think that's been a real benefit to not only our district but to the community at large, to get a real understanding of what has actually happened in our budget every year.
Yeah, there's no question. And when we talk about this per pupil expenditure, you hear in Connecticut a lot of discussion around equity and adequacy. And, we think about it's great terms to say, but this is a story that talks about funding in Connecticut and how funding is either done equitably or not. And we want to be very clear about this. Students who need more, communities who need more, should get more. And we want to set that tone very, very clear. So you kind of alluded to this. You talked about our total proposed budget. And I think this gets confusing. And I'm glad you also mentioned talking about transparency and clarity. Two words that are oftentimes used in governmental affairs and in politics. Everybody wants to be transparent. And I know we've worked hard to be transparent in this process as well. But, let's face it, this is really complicated stuff. I mean, we talk about almost 3 different budgets. We talk about our all-in budget, we talk about our grants budget, and we talk about our district budget. For our viewers at home, can you kind of explain how our budget is made up?
Basically, if you're looking at this chart at home, what it's showing is that our budget really is consisting of multiple funding sources. The basis for our budget is the state's education cost sharing grant. It's the funding that comes from the state of Connecticut towards public education for all of the towns in Connecticut. That funding is just over $47 million that the town of East Hartford will receive towards public education. The addition to that is a taxpayer contribution to the school system's operating budget, which for next year is estimated to be about $52 million. In addition to that, we've been really successful over the past 8 or 9 years in bringing in primarily state grants to the school district, as well as some federal dollars and foundation grants, which are really new to us over the last 4 years, but have really paid dividends for our students in the district. So when you look at an all-in budget for us, for the investment from the taxpayers of just over $52 million, that they're getting $126 million worth of resources and dollars coming into this district from all of these various sources. So there's a lot of work and a lot of effort that goes on to make all of this happen. But what this means for the district is we have upwards to 380 positions in our school district funded through grants.
Right.
Those positions are there because they're funded through grants.
Right.
And that's making a difference for our kids. Those are intervention staff, those are coaches, those are additional math teachers, kindergarten teachers, and it's really, paying dividends for our students and our families. So when you really weigh in on just what is happening in East Hartford, there are quite a bit of resources that are being linked in ways that really benefit our community and move education forward in East Hartford.
Yeah, I think I love the way you broke this down and the complexity of this, and trying to make it simple. I mean, we've gone through dozens of different graphics to try to tell this story. I think the other interesting story is our budget is only a piece of the town's budget. And our mayor and our, obviously, town finance team are putting together a budget that includes our budget as part of the overall town budget, which ultimately will be approved as well. Can you talk about what our relationship is, how that works, what that looks like in building this process?
We've really have built a strong relationship working directly with the town's finance office and our business office at the public school district. There are so many things that we're working together on, primarily around health benefits and insurances and workers' compensation. We really have done a good job basically linking the work that's going on in the town with respect to the preparation of the town budget as well as ours and what we're doing in the district. You can see the results of that as issues bubble up in our process and how they're addressed by both our financial staff, the financial staff on the town, how the audits are done each year and basically collaboratively with the town of East Hartford, and ultimately with the policy leaders. When you actually begin a budget process in the fall where you have a joint meeting of the town council and the Board of Education and the mayor and the town's finance office as well as ours, you really get a sense of the big picture. Yeah. What is it the town's facing this year, and how can we together make something work for the benefit of the residents and for us, the students in East Hartford Public Schools? And that truly makes a difference, and it's unique to East Hartford. We're probably one of the few districts in Connecticut where the municipalities and or towns work so closely with their boards of education to try and make things work for the community. Yeah,
and when it comes to these type of complex challenges, there are no easy answers. The best process we know to answer these questions is work together. And I'm really proud of what your team's done and appreciative of the mayor and obviously the town finance team and Mr. Walsh to put these things together. So kind of continue to dive in. Our budget history, I always feel like for families at home that look at our budget, typically budgets get reported based on percent increase. And we define a good budget or a bad budget based on its relationship to the budgets in the past. So what is our relationship of this budget to budgets in the past? What does that look like?
Basically, in our operating budget, we've had increases of just about 1% for almost a decade. But we've been able to make that work. It's not a perfect system. It's certainly not comparable to what goes on with some of the more affluent towns right around East Hartford. But for us, is to have to make at least incremental progress each year does make a difference. Yeah. Because it's important to recognize that there are fixed costs that are going to be part of an operating budget, particularly around salaries and benefit costs and things like that, that are triggers each year to push the budget a little bit higher. And again, having an incremental changes from one year to the next does make a difference. But again, it's a pretty static budget that we've been building for so long. And the result of that, and it's been a good result in our favor, is the amount of additional money we've been able to bring in primarily through the state and through the federal programs for education. And that's truly made a difference for us.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about a 1% increase over essentially the last decade, pretty consistently,
Yes.
you know, and some years certainly that's been a flat line, hard zero. But that's remarkable when we think about what cost of living increases are. And certainly for our taxpayers at home, you know, $94 million budget is a huge budget. We don't want to pretend that's not. But when we talk about being conservative and we talk about being prudent and we talk about being very minimal as far as growth, this certainly meets those definitions. So looking at our budget, looking at the percent increase that we're talking about, this is a large budget proposal for us as a district. This is extremely large. When we talk about 10 years, 1% increase, and we're almost looking at a 3.7% increase here. We define increases in a budget with two factors. We talk about revenue factors, and essentially there's what press our budget down. That's money, good money into the system. And then we talk about expenditures. Ultimately, that's what drives the budget up. We want more revenue, less expenditure. So, you know, we've had several on the revenue side. We've had some very positive things that we're projecting into this budget. Can you kind of talk to us about what are those revenues that we're counting on?
Well, one of the things that we've done this year, and it's really working with our state delegation that's helped us tremendously at the Capitol. They've increased the appropriation for our state alliance grant funding by almost $1.5 million. That's new money that the expectation will come into our budget on July 1st of this year. What that means for us is when we're preparing the budget for both the super yourself and the Board of Education, we were able to take 13 kindergarten teachers as well as other district staff that were funded in the general budget and move them now into the State Alliance grant funding. That helps us keep our budget, our overall percentage of increase, just under 4% in the big picture. But it's really critical that's been able to happen, and then our state delegation has done such good work in getting funding for East Hartford Public Schools. The other areas where we've had some success over the years is the Woodland program that we run for students outside of East Hartford. That program brings upwards of $6 million in additional revenue for us that helps us with our special education costs and deflects some of the expenses for our students going outside our district for services. So that's very important to us. The other areas where we've made some progress is in Medicaid reimbursements for students that do receive services through the Department of Social Services, as well as the prepayment of debt service, which has been a big expense, because basically what we've been paying down for the better part of a decade now is pretty much a master lease for heating, ventilation, and lighting projects that were done over a decade ago. We're still paying down that lease, and that's upwards to $750,000 this year.
Kind of like a mortgage.
It's kind of like a mortgage.
Yeah.
We've paid that down, but we've also, and this gets to our work with the town's finance office, is come up with another accounting mechanism to help defray the impact of that $750,000 moving forward in the out years now of this master lease. So what we've been able to do working with the town is to reduce that amount to just over $300,000 next year, and to put it within our operating budget and pay it down over the next 4 years. That actually will help us bring more money back into our operating budget as we go through the year by not having to commit $750,000 for a master lease payment for the next 5 years.
Yeah, so I wish we could stop the presentation here. I wish we could stop here because we've been talking about revenue. These are good things. Unfortunately, we can't. We got to talk about the expenditure side. These are costs. I think, summarizing in my mind what you said, which was incredibly important, is this budget includes significant projections. We are projecting $1.5 million of funding from the state in addition to ECS dollars. Those aren't guaranteed dollars, and certainly what happens in Hartford over the next few months playing out, we know where our state delegation stands on this. We know what they're working for to achieve the bipartisan formula that should bring more money to East Hartford. But we need that to happen. That's the bottom line. This budget doesn't work without those dollars.
And that's true. But again, everyone's working together on this, which is a good thing. And we have made some assumptions, but they are conservative and they're realistic in line with what the approved state budget was for the last 2 years. So I mean, we are in good standing in that regard. But again, it is it's somewhat of a guess of what ultimately will happen, and obviously anything that would deflect or redirect those fundings for another purpose outside of East Hartford Public Schools will be certainly problematic for us, and we'll have to work through it.
Yeah.
But on the expenditure side, and as you can see how the scales are tipping, there are some budget drivers this year that are important to recognize, and the most significant is an increase in the cost of health benefits for the employees and their families that work in the school district. Increases in medical claims, as well as just the overall increases in medical costs, have added almost $2.5 million to that cost next year for us, which is incredibly high. But again, it is real, and again, you can see how the claims history is playing out over the course of this year, and it has increased, as well as the overall increase in medical expenses.
Can you talk a little bit about our plan design? I know for our more savvy folks at home or anyone who works in healthcare, certainly we all hear about the cost of healthcare. What we've done as a district to try to repress, despite this is almost a $2 million jump here, but what else have we done to try to avoid this?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things going on. There's wellness programs on the town side, on the Board of Education side. There are things we try to do with our staff to make them more cognizant of health care and health care costs. The insurance programs we put in place, the platforms with the health savings account and high deductible plans have paid true dividends to both the town and the board in saving the overall cost on the cost of medical insurance. What people need to understand is that when we talk about health benefits and being claims-based and self-insured, that if there are catastrophic illnesses in a family, they're very expensive, and that's what drives the cost.
Right.
And that's something that you need to recognize. It may not be the volume of our employees that actually are enrolled in the insurance program. It may be just a few employees that are dealing with major issues, medical issues, that are driving the overall cost for insurances for us.
Right. So for our viewers at home who aren't actuarialists or insurance people, hang with us. The bottom line to that was we've had a significant spike in our health insurance benefits. And this budget is really what drives this budget as far as cost are those increases. What are some other increases?
The other increases that you'll see are just contractual increases for salaries. One of the things that we've done, and we've worked, again, this is another area we work closely with the town, is to develop and try and get general wage increases and benefits to be comparable on both the board and the town side, and stay within a certain parameters of an overall cost of a contract. Yeah. We recently had an arbitrated settlement with our teachers union that fell just under 8% over the course of 3 years, which, when you look at the overall cost for general wage increases, step increases, and being all in on that contract, was a significant result for us to achieve, to keep that contract below 8%. Yeah. And that was important. But again, salaries and contracts do change each year, and we've been able to hold our general wage increases at or just below 2% for quite a few years now for our unions. The other areas that are significant are student transportation. One of the things that doesn't get recognized is to transport our students, as well as the special ed students in the district, costs us almost $6.3 million, which is by far much higher than what we would spend on technology, what we would spend on improving our buildings, by far. But it's significant when you look at the overall cost of transporting students. And this is basically representative of 73 buses on the road every day, as well as some outplaced transportation for students that are receiving services outside the boundaries of East Hartford. But it's a significant cost to the district. And in the proposed budget for next year, we are asking for the additional of one vehicle to help support the special ed student needs in the district. Yeah. So that's an additional bus at a cost of about $65,000.
So for our parents at home, when the request is for additional stops, additional routes, I hope they hear this. We don't want to say no. The reality is there's $6.3 million going into transportation, just getting our kids to and from school, and we really prefer to invest dollars in the school where our kids learn.
Well, again, that's what we try to work on every day, because it's an incredible expense for school districts, and it is just providing transportation. It's safe transportation back and forth to school and their homes, but it is an expensive proposition for a school district. Yeah. And then the other things that sort of weigh into us, and utility costs, as those of you at home realize, rates go up, costs go up. If we have if we have a cold winter and spring, things are...
Polar vortex truly breaks.
The polar vortex breaks is today's current. We're going to have problems with our utility costs. But again, we have measures and things in place in our facilities department to try and mitigate that to the extent we can. But those are the kinds of fixed costs and factors that are affecting the budget. And that's why the idea of transparency and clarity is really important, because when you look at our operating budget, there's not a lot in there.
Yeah.
I mean, once you look at our staffing and you look at the benefits associated with staffing and some of the fixed costs that we have, it's representative of 80% of the budget. And when you throw student transportation in that mix, and you look at magnet school tuitions, there's not much left for an operating budget.
No. Paul, it's again, for families who are interested in greater details on this, we have a series of several presentations that have been developed that are posted online, and your office posts those in addition to our budget book that I think is very clear with rationales for each line, each program line. We would really encourage any interested community member to take a look at that. Go on easthartford.org, click on, you'll see it is in our news agenda items, news items, budget, and it'll take you through some presentations, and those are a guide. And if additional questions arise, don't hesitate to contact either of us. We love to talk about these things and try to understand, try to provide clarity around them. So the budget is sitting with the council. There's a few things on the table that we've talked about as far as this 3.7% increase. Do you have any thoughts on that, or anything that could be looked for community members as part of this conversation that will evolve? Well,
I think really what everyone needs to understand is that the 3.7% is directly tied to health benefits for the most part. That's the big increase in our proposed budget for next year. It's $2.5 million. If you were to back that out and be able to flatline that expense, we'd be less than 2% for an increase, which basically would reflect contractual increases, student transportation, and utilities. That's where we would be. And that's really important for everyone to have an understanding of. There aren't new initiatives and things like that happening within the general operating budget. Those types of programs for our students are all happening with foundation funding, with state funding, with federal funding, and that's what's made the difference. So I think really the takeaways would be that it is a straightforward operating budget. And when you look at the big expenditures in the operating budget, which again are around staffing and benefits and student transportation and magnet schools, there's just not a lot left that you can really look at and say that might be, there may be too much money in that line item because it's just not there. No, it's a great thing. So key takeaways here, certainly number one, contingent on the following projections. Our health benefit expenditures, we'll continue to monitor them as the year goes along. Contingent on the Alliance grant revenues, or that additional $1.5 million that we spent a lot of time talking about. Contingent on the fact that we flat funded our special education and magnet school accounts. You and I spent some time on that today. Actually, that is very important that those things come through flat. As well as in addition, the state funds the agreement with East Hartford on the 7% cap that brings almost $900,000 in. And then finally, these revenue adjustments that we've made in this budget process worth almost $400,000 carry through. So this is a budget that for our families at home, there are no layoffs in this budget. And we aren't adding positions in this budget. And this process will continue to move through the state and town process. So kind of bringing this full picture, Paul, really appreciate all your work on this and your leadership on this. You and your team do a phenomenal job. Appreciate the mayor and the town council's job, as well as our board. Our board does I'm really proud of our board and their depth of understanding and questions. That's it from the classroom. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a little bit about our budget today. If we can be supportive on that, if we can explain further details, we're always happy to do so. Wish you all the best, and we'll see you the next time.